Okay. So again, I really kind of just talked about the first part already, but if you have an organism that goes through asexual reproduction, that means it's just one parent producing the offspring. And so in the case of eukaryotic organisms, we're just doing mitosis. And hopefully you remember from the end of that mitosis quick check, what's true about the daughter cells, the new cells that get made compared to the original starting cell. They're exactly the same, right? They have all the same exact genes. They're identical to each other genetically. So when we're doing asexual reproduction, we're basically just cloning ourselves. Well, we don't do it, but the organisms that do are cloning themselves. Versus sexual reproduction, in that case, you have two parents. So you get half of the DNA from the one parent, half of the DNA from the other parent. Okay, so you're going to have a genetically unique individual that's not like their mom or like their dad. It has some combinations of both. So that's what we're going to focus on over the next few days. We talk about meiosis is really just the mixing up of that genetic material. So that's a really key, important thing to keep in mind as we go through this. So we're going to spend some time talking more about the kind of pros and cons to both of those reproduction strategies. And we're also going to just kind of compare the results of meiosis and mitosis a little bit more. And so kind of one of the key takeaways today is that meiosis is a reductive division. What do you think that means? If you're reducing something, that means you're making it less, right, or smaller. And so it's a reductive division. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, what that means. And then again, just some of the advantages and disadvantages of both of those reproduction strategies. Also, we'll get into this vocab a little bit more tomorrow, but there's the term diploid. That prefix di means two versus haploid, which means one or half of diploid. And so those are some really important terms we'll put on more over the next couple of days. Do those terms sound familiar to you at all from Value 1? A little bit. Okay, so just some quick slides, and then we'll get into the group discussion today. So for cell division, for asexual reproduction, if you're a eukaryote, you're going through mitosis. And so we've already mentioned this a couple times. In this case, you're producing cells with exactly the same genetic information. So you're making identical daughter cells. I don't know how many different ways we can say this, but you're ending up with exactly the same copy of DNA in those daughter cells as you started with in the parent cell, minus any mistakes that happen during DNA replication. Right? So we talked a little bit about during DNA replication how sometimes mistakes get made. And so those individuals are essentially clones of each other. So just real quick with your group members, can you think of some eukaryotic organisms that do reproduce asexually? Well, they're prokaryotes, so they do binary fission instead of mitosis. They're prokaryotes. They do binary fission. Lots of plants. Lots of plants can reproduce asexually. And there's lots of organisms that do both. So like corals, for example, or a lot of sponges can do asexual and sexual reproduction. So they have different life cycles there for that. So here's some other, this is just kind of a list and some examples. So we have all single-celled eukaryotes are going to reproduce asexually. So yeast, which is a fungus, for example, they just bud off. So here's some yeast budding off. Any protists, so remember that's another kingdom in the eukaryote domain. So any paramecium or amoeba, here's an amoeba up here that's dividing through mitosis. Some simple multicellular eukaryotes. So this is the hydra over there. You can see it budding off the clone. And then again, a lot of plants can do both those processes. So like potatoes, for example, if you kept potatoes apart, you know, they'll grow like hot potato eyes. What we're also pointing out, and I know this is getting kind of low on the screen, here's our parent cell. So how many pairs of homologous chromosomes do we have here? We have 3 pairs, right? So 1, 2, 3 similar chromosomes. The daughter cells have exactly the same chromosomes in them, right? So when these duplicate, then we divide, each cell is going to give an exact copy. We're going to talk about that more in a little bit. So for the rest of us, a lot of complex multicellular organisms that reproduce, we do so sexually. So at some point, there's a joining of an egg or a cell that's like an egg from one parent and a sperm or a cell that's similar to that from the other parent. And when those join, then we get our new offspring, right? So we're getting half from one parent, half from the other. And so the next big question there is, do we make egg and sperm by mitosis? So go ahead and spend a couple seconds in your group. Yes or no? If not, why not?
Yeah.
I don't know. No, this is 6. Is it? I'm sorry.
Okay. The answer to this is no. Right? But just to kind of help you think about why we don't make egg and sperm through mitosis is if we did, how many so first of all, how many chromosomes are in each one of our cells? 46. Okay, so 46 in each one of our body cells. Again, half of those came from mom and half of those came from dad. So 23 from mom. So if instead we made egg and sperm from mitosis, how many chromosomes would each one of those cells have? We would have the full 46. So when you join them together, what would happen? You would have 92, okay, which is twice too many. Okay? And if that individual then tried to make egg and sperm through mitosis, their egg or sperm would also have 92. So we would double the number of chromosomes every generation. There's a lot of problems with doing that. So we can't make egg and sperm through mitosis. Instead, we need to reduce that number of chromosomes. Okay, so this is just a closer, this is kind of backtracking. I probably should have done this first. So this is what we call a karyotype. This is all the chromosomes that are taken out of one body cell. Okay, so again, we have 46 total chromosomes in each body cell. Which means we have 23 pairs of homologous chromosomes, right? So each of these pairs, one came from mom, one came from dad, one came from mom, one came from mom. The only kind of exception to this, although they still pair up during this process, are sex chromosomes. So in this case, this individual has 2 X chromosomes, which means they are genetically or chromosomally female. So for humans, this is different for different species, but 2 X chromosomes means you're chromosomally female. And if we look at this chromosome, again, we can see 23 pairs, except this time this individual has 1 X and 1 Y. So this individual, this human is chromosomally male. Now we've talked about homologous chromosomes already, but again, these are pairs of chromosomes that carry matching genes, right? So they have the same genes. However, because they're coming from different parents, the versions of those genes can be different. But because they carry matching genes, those chromosomes are going to be used to control the same inherited characters. And so I know this is hopefully a little bit of a review from what we talked about with chromosomes already. And so if you look at each one of those 23 pairs minus the sex chromosome, they're going to have all the same genes on those chromosomes. Different versions of them, but same genes, affecting the same traits. And that's where the name comes from. Homo means same, and logos means information. So they contain similar information on them. And here's one of those important vocab terms I mentioned at the beginning of class. So all of our body cells are diploid. And again, diploid, di means 2. This N really means copies. So 2N means we have 2 copies of each chromosome. And there's a notation we use because different organisms have different number of chromosomes. We have 46, but different organisms have different amounts. So there's a notation we use. So in this case, we're saying when you have 2 copies, then we have this cell has a total of 4 chromosomes. And if we think about the cell cycle, they start off as single-stranded homologous chromosomes in G1. In the S phase, what happens? The DNA duplicates, right? And that's when we get our sister chromatids. We have our X-shaped double-stranded homologous. Yeah, I think hopefully that slide's mostly a review, but is there any questions on anything on that slide before we move on? Okay. So when we go through meiosis, again, this is a reductive process. So here's one of mom's somatic body cells. In order to make an egg, we have to cut that chromosome number in half. So we have to go from being diploid, having 2 of each copy, to being haploid, having 1 of each copy. Okay. And that way, same thing for dad. So each of his body cells have 46. When he makes sperm, we again have to go from being diploid to being haploid. So from 2 copies to 1. So when we join them back together again during fertilization, our zygote, our new offspring, is going to have the full complement, all 46. So that's why we have to do meiosis instead of meiosis. So reductive process, we go from having 2 copies of being diploid, having 1 copy of each being haploid. I think that's, oh, there's a couple of slides. Almost done. Again, I'm just going to emphasize this. Haploid, human, haploid, 1N. 2 copies, haploid, 1 copy. So again, when we do the fertilization process, now we end up back with an organism that is diploid and has 2 copies. 1 set of copies from dad, 1 set of copies from mom. So this is just going to repeat some of what we said. the reductive division. And we only do meiosis in order to make those gametes, okay, in order to make those egg and sperm. So this is just a special cell division that only occurs if you're going to go through sexual reproduction. We're only going to pass on half of our chromosomes, one of each homologous chromosome to our offspring. So again, this means we're going from 2 copies to 1 copy. Kind of start getting familiar with that notation. New terms, diploid to haploid. So again, 2 copies to 1 copy. We're having 2 of each to half of that. Again, that's making gametes. So gametes is just another word for reproductive cells and for egg and sperm. So egg and sperm are gametes. So for animals, those are sperm and eggs. For plants, for example, you have like ova and pollen, right? So pollen's kind of the plant equivalent to sperm. And as we go through meiosis evolved from mitosis. So a lot of the stages in the machinery are the same. So we're using spindle fibers. We go through the same like major stages: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. But in some ways, they're very different from each other. So we're going to do a lot of comparing and contrasting of mitosis to meiosis starting tomorrow, and we really start to look more at the stages. Okay. One last slide after that. Kind of hard to get back in the swing of being in class after like a month, isn't it? And I get to talk, so that at least keeps me awake. So, just wanted to point out that we have, so there's 3 different diagrams. And again, I know this is really low to the screen, so you might have a hard time seeing these. So we have some algae here. So we have some protists, we have animals, and we have plants. And so I just want to point out that different organisms have different life cycles. So they're going to use haploid and diploid strategies differently. So, for example, a lot of algae actually spend most of their life cycle in the haploid stage and only a small section of the diploid stage. Okay, most animals, we spend most of our time in the diploid stage, right? And it's very small amount in the haploid stage. Although eggs are around for a really long time. And then here's some plants. You can see in this case, these ferns spend about half and half. So half is haploid, half is diploid cell. And so I just want to kind of point that out before we move on to it. So that's the last slide. When you're ready, go ahead and get your Chromebooks out. Head to today's agenda. Or I can head straight to it from the calendar. It's 8.4 reproduction discussion. And that's going to prompt you to make a copy of the document. If you want to, you can share it with your group. This isn't for a grade, just for some discussion and notes. And so this is divided into parts. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to talk about it in your group and come up with an answer to the whatever question of the section we're on, and then we're going to talk about it as class. So I'll give you a few minutes to read that intro there and then answer question number 1 in your group. eventually can talk about the question. And so in this case, the answer is like pretty much in the reading, right? So, like, what are some reasons why asexual reproduction might be preferred over sexual reproduction? It takes a lot of energy, right? And it has a lot of risk. It talks about, well, first of all the time and energy it takes to find a mate in the first place. Which, if you watch any nature show, you know, animals have all kinds of different ways to do that, right? To attract mates and find them. It takes a lot of time and energy. You think about like birds, for example, all that bright plumage they use increases their risk of getting eaten. You have potential transmitted diseases. And sometimes, even if you do end up finding a mate, it doesn't result in offspring. So there's a lot of energy that goes into sexual reproduction, into that process. And so basically, what's the point? Why do we go through all of that if we could just clone ourselves? And so that's what we're kind of going to look at over the next couple of sections of the discussion. So any questions on that first part before we move on? I know sometimes it can be uncomfortable to talk about this, but hopefully you feel comfortable enough to think about it. This is just biological terms. So. All right, part one, number of offspring generated. So take a couple seconds, read through that. There's a model here that you're going to use to answer those questions. The next question. Okay, so take some time to look over that with your group. Please discuss it. Just look at the model. Talk about that. The model should be enough to answer questions. Please talk together. So basically the point of this is just to look at how many offspring are generated per generation, right? So based on this model, which mode of reproduction should be able to produce more organisms in the same amount of time? Asexual, right? So that mode should technically, if we're just considering number of offspring, should be more beneficial, right? So the more offspring that you're able to have per time, that would be beneficial to the population. So that would allow us to grow quicker. So not only does sexual reproduction take more time and energy, in fact, this is definitely magnified by the fact it takes a lot less time to reproduce asexually. So really, we produce people reproducing even more individuals asexually than sexually. Per two. So there's a decent chunk of reading here. So take some time to read through that. We're going to be looking at this model here on the right to help you answer that question. Just think of deleterious as bad mutations. So way back when we talked about DNA replication, we did mention that mistakes do happen, right? So very low amounts, but they do happen. And so over very long stretches of time, mutations are going to start to build up. If you have, especially if you have smaller populations, there's a good chance that every once in a while, a good chunk of the population will get wiped out. And so if we look at this model, basically what's happening over time. So here we have the number of bad mutations over the X chromosome. And here the red bars are basically telling us how much of them we have, right? So if we're starting at time 1, we have kind of this bell curve here where there's a kind of an average of 3, prevalence of 3 bad mutations in the population. If we keep reproducing asexually, though, we keep picking up mutations, eventually what's going to happen over time? more and more of the population are going to contain those bad mutations because they're copies of their parents, right? So, and it's very, very hard once those mutations are in the population to get them out, right? Because we're just copying ourselves. So that's kind of the first thing to think about. So far, we talked about how asexual reproduction is a lot better than sexual reproduction for a lot of reasons. But here's an issue of why maybe it might not be best all the time. And this is the really last part. So if you've been working ahead, that's fine. But so take some time, read this carefully. Okay? And there's actually a couple questions that go along with this 4 and 5. So give you some time to talk about that. But this first part is just kind of a setup information. So we have this kind of interesting species where there's two sexes, and because of that, they can actually do both types of reproduction normally. Yeah. Well, after we're all done talking about it, then maybe we're not done with it yet. So we're just going to talk about it. So in this setup here, we have these hermaphrodite worms. So they're a type of worm that actually has both male and female parts, so they can reproduce asexually by themselves, or there's also males in this species that they can reproduce with the hermaphrodites sexually. So population 1 here only has the selfing hermaphrodites, so there's a lethal mutation, so no males are present in the population. And so that population is only going to be reproducing asexually. Population 2 has normal hermaphrodites and males, so in that case, they're going to be able to produce both asexually and sexually. So they have both options available. And then population 3 has both hermaphrodites and males, but there's a mutation in the hermaphrodites, so they couldn't produce sperm. So basically saying the hermaphrodites can't do what? They can't reproduce by themselves. So this population is only producing sexually. Okay, so 3 different populations, 1 only reproducing asexually, 1 doing both, and 1 only producing sexually. And those are the 3 groups that you're looking at in this table down here. So I'll give you a little bit more time if you haven't gotten to it yet to read that paragraph, look at that graph, answer question number 5. So fitness is basically how many offspring you end up having. So think about it in terms of how many offspring you're able to have. And this 0 line is like keeping the population stable. So I think that this, when it was in black and white, this was gray. The yellow was gray. So sorry, that's another thing. So these are the ones that were in a rugged terrain, a stressful environment. These are the ones that were experiencing lots of mutations. I'm going to help you think about it. But ultimately, question number 5 here, when we put populations in stressful environment, what type of reproductive strategy does better? The sexual one does, in both cases, right? So when it's in just a tough environment, it's higher, and also it's especially true if there's a lot of mutations going on, right? So the population that reproduce only asexually, their amount of fitness, the amount of offspring they could have, went down by 60%. Okay, so when there were a lot of mutations in about 20% when they were in really stressful situations. So something about mixing up the genes and going through sexual reproduction allows populations to do better and succeed in really stressful environments. Okay, so that's kind of the takeaway from that last part. So that is all I have for you today. I do not have a quick check yet because we have a lot of information still to cover in this section. If you haven't spent much time on your study guide this unit though, and you have time, I would suggest using some time to do that. So I'll let you chill for the rest of class. Hopefully we can get a little more talkative as the semester goes on. Okay, so that's it for me today. Thank you. You don't have to turn that in since we talked about it. But you definitely need to be able to pull out some advantages and disadvantages of each type of strategy from that.